The fancy music hall sparkled with golden lights. Rich people in expensive clothes walked around drinking champagne from crystal glasses. Everyone talked in quiet voices about classical music and famous composers. The air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers. Victor Ashworth stood near the big black piano on stage. He wore a perfect black suit that cost more than most people made in a month. His dark hair was styled perfectly, and his expensive watch caught the light when he moved his hands. Victor was 32 years old and famous around the world for playing piano. He had played in the best concert halls in Paris, London, and New York. Tonight, everyone wanted to talk to him. "Victor, your performance of Chopin last week was amazing," said Mrs. Wellington, an older woman covered in diamonds. "I've never heard anything so beautiful." Victor smiled, but his eyes looked cold. "Thank you. Of course, it takes years of proper training to play Chopin correctly. Not everyone can understand real classical music." He looked around the room at all the wealthy people nodding and agreeing with him. Victor loved being the center of attention. He loved how people treated him like he was special, like he was better than everyone else. The concert had ended an hour ago, but Victor stayed for the party afterward. He enjoyed talking about how difficult his music was and how few people could play like him. To Victor, there were two types of people in the world: real musicians like himself and everyone else who just pretended to understand music. "I studied at Juilliard, you know," Victor told a group of people gathered around him. "Only the very best musicians get accepted there. We learned from masters who had played for kings and queens. Real music requires proper education, proper training, proper background." The people around him made impressed sounds. Victor felt proud and important. He had worked hard to get where he was, but he had also been lucky. His rich parents had paid for the best piano teachers since he was 5 years old. They bought him the finest pianos and sent him to the most expensive music schools. Victor never thought about how lucky he was. He believed he deserved everything, because he was naturally better than other people. While Victor talked to his admirers, Maria Santos quietly pushed her cleaning cart through the back hallways of the music hall. She wore a simple gray uniform and comfortable shoes that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her hands showed the rough marks of someone who worked hard every day. Maria was 28 years old, but she looked tired in a way that made her seem older. She had been working as a night janitor at the music hall for 3 years. Every night after the fancy concerts ended and the rich people went home, Maria came to work. She cleaned the bathrooms, emptied the trash, and mopped the floors until everything sparkled for the next day. Most nights Maria worked alone in the big empty building. She liked the quiet after all the noise and excitement of the concerts. But there was something else she liked even more. When no one was around, Maria would sneak into the main concert hall and look at the beautiful grand piano on stage. Tonight was different, though. The party was still going on, so Maria had to wait. She cleaned the offices and storage rooms first, listening to the sounds of laughter and music coming from the main hall. Maria knew she should stay away until everyone left, but something pulled her toward the concert hall. She pushed her cart quietly to the back entrance and peeked inside. The room was still full of people in fancy clothes. Maria had never seen such beautiful dresses and jewelry. For a moment she imagined what it would feel like to wear something so elegant, to belong in a place like this. But Maria knew she didn't belong here. She was just the cleaning lady. These people probably didn't even see her when she worked. She was invisible to them just part of the background like the chairs and tables. As Maria watched, she saw Victor standing by the piano, still talking to a crowd of admirers. Even from far away, she could see how confident he looked, how sure of himself. Maria had heard him play many times while she worked. She had to admit he was very good, technically perfect in every way. But something about Victor bothered Maria. Maybe it was the way he talked about music like it belonged only to people like him. Maybe it was how he looked down on anyone who hadn't studied at fancy schools. Maria believed music was for everyone, rich or poor, educated or not. The party started to wind down. People began saying goodbye and heading for the exits. Maria watched Victor shake hands and accept more compliments. She waited until most people had left before slowly walking into the main hall with her cleaning supplies. Maria tried to be invisible as she emptied trash cans and wiped down tables, but her eyes kept going to the piano. The beautiful black instrument seemed to call to her. She had dreamed about playing it so many times. Victor was still there, talking to the last few guests. Maria worked her way closer to the stage, cleaning as she went. Finally, she was close enough to see the piano keys clearly. They looked so smooth and perfect, like white and black teeth in a giant smile. Without thinking, Maria reached out and gently touched one of the white keys. The sound was soft and pure, like a drop of water in a quiet pond. For just a moment, Maria forgot where she was. She touched another key, then another, playing a simple melody she remembered from childhood. The sound was so beautiful that Maria closed her eyes and smiled. For those few seconds, she wasn't a janitor in a gray uniform. She was just someone who loved music, sharing a moment with an instrument that understood her heart. "Excuse me? What do you think you're doing?" Victor's sharp voice cut through Maria's. Peaceful moment like a knife. She opened her eyes and saw him walking toward her with an angry expression. The few remaining guests turned to look at what was happening. Maria quickly pulled her hand away from the piano. Her face turned red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just cleaning and I accidentally touched—" "Accidentally?" Victor laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "That didn't look accidental to me. Do you have any idea how much this piano costs? It's worth more than you'll make in your entire life." The remaining guests gathered around to watch the scene. Maria felt very small standing there in her cleaning uniform while these fancy people stared at her. She wanted to disappear. "I didn't hurt anything," Maria said quietly. "I just touched it very gently." "Just touched it?" Victor's voice got louder. "This is a concert grand piano, not a toy. It requires proper care and handling. You can't just come along with your dirty cleaning hands and start banging on the keys." Maria looked down at her hands. They were clean, though they showed the signs of hard work. Small cuts from cleaning supplies, calluses from scrubbing floors, nails kept short and practical. Suddenly, she felt ashamed of her hands, ashamed of her work, ashamed of herself. "Do you even know what this instrument is?" Victor continued, enjoying having an audience for his lecture. "This is a Steinway Model D concert grand. Only master pianists are qualified to play it. It takes years of training, proper education, refined technique." One of the guests, Mrs. Wellington, tittered behind her jeweled hand. "Really, Victor? Perhaps the cleaning staff should be better supervised." Victor nodded seriously. "Exactly. My point. This is what happens when people don't understand their place. Next thing you know, she'll be claiming she can actually play piano." Something in Victor's tone made Maria look up. There was such smugness in his voice, such certainty. that someone like her could never understand music. It reminded her of every time someone had told her she didn't belong somewhere, every time someone had made her feel small because of her job or her background. "Actually," Maria said softly, "I do play piano." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Victor's eyebrows went up in surprise, then he started laughing. Soon the other guests were laughing too. The sound echoed through the concert hall, bouncing off the walls and filling Maria's ears with their amusement at her expense. "You play piano?" Victor could barely get the words out between laughs. "Oh, that's rich. I suppose you learned at some community center playing chopsticks on an old keyboard?" The laughter got louder. Maria felt her cheeks burning, but something else was growing inside her chest. It wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was anger. Clean, pure anger at the way these people assumed they knew everything about her just by looking at her uniform. "Let me guess," Victor continued, wiping tears from his eyes. "You probably think playing the radio counts as musical education. Or maybe you learned from YouTube videos." More laughter. Maria stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. She thought about her grandmother's old stories, about the broken keyboard they had found, about all the nights she had practiced in secret. These people knew nothing about her story, nothing about what music meant to her. Victor was enjoying himself now. He had an audience, and he loved showing off his superiority. "This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. Real music requires real training. You can't just decide you're a musician because you touched a piano once." Something changed in the air of the room. The laughter died down as people sensed a shift in the mood. Maria raised her head and looked directly at Victor. Her dark eyes were steady and calm, but there was steel in them now. "Would you like to find out?" Maria asked simply. Victor stopped laughing. "Find out what?" "Whether I can really play piano or not." The concert H. Victor stared at Maria for a long moment. The silence in the concert hall stretched like a rubber band about to snap. The remaining guests looked back and forth between the famous pianist and the cleaning lady, waiting to see what would happen. Finally, Victor started laughing again, but this time it sounded forced. "Oh, this is perfect. You want to prove you can play piano? Against me?" He gestured to himself dramatically. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes," Maria said quietly. "You're Victor. Ashworth, I've heard you play many times while I work here. And do you know what that means?" Victor's voice got sharper. "I've performed at Carnegie Hall, the Royal Opera House, the Berlin Philharmonic. I've played for presidents and prime ministers. My recordings have won Grammy Awards." Maria nodded. "I know you're very good." "Very good?" Victor laughed harshly. "I'm not just very good. I'm one of the finest classical pianists in the world. And you think you can challenge me? You, a janitor who probably learned to play on some broken piano in a church basement?" The guests murmured among themselves, clearly enjoying this unexpected entertainment. Mrs. Wellington whispered to her friend, "This should be amusing. The poor dear has no idea what she's gotten herself into." But as Maria stood there, something was happening inside her mind. Memories were flooding back, memories she usually tried to keep buried because they hurt too much to remember. She thought about her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Maria was 7. They had lived in a tiny apartment in East Los Angeles, where the walls were thin and the neighbors were loud. Abuela Rosa cleaned houses for rich families during the day and took in sewing at night to make enough money for rent and food. Maria remembered the day when she was 10 years old, and Abuela Rosa came home excited. more excited than Maria had ever seen her. "Mija, look what I found," she had said, struggling to pull something through the front door. It was a keyboard, old and broken, with several keys that didn't work and others that stuck when you pressed them. Abuela Rosa had found it in a dumpster behind one of the houses she cleaned. The family had thrown it away when they bought a new digital piano for their daughter. "The señora said I could take it," Abuela Rosa explained, breathing hard from carrying the heavy keyboard up 3 flights of stairs. "She said maybe you would like it." Maria had stared at the broken instrument. She had never shown any interest in music before, but something about the keyboard called to her. When she pressed the working keys, they made beautiful sounds that seemed to fill up all the empty, sad places in her heart. "Can you teach me to play, Abuela?" Maria had asked. Abuela Rosa's face fell. "Oh, mija, I don't know how to play piano. We don't have money for lessons. But maybe you can learn by yourself?" And that's exactly what Maria had done. She spent hours every day after school sitting at the broken keyboard, figuring out which keys made which sounds. She learned to play melodies by ear, listening to music on the radio and trying to copy what she heard. The broken keyboard became her best friend. When other kids at school made fun of her second-hand clothes or her grandmother's accent, Maria would come home and play. When she felt lonely or scared, the music made everything better. As she got older, Maria discovered the public library had books about music, and even some old CDs she could borrow. She taught herself to read music by studying the books and comparing them to songs she already knew how to play. It was slow and difficult, but Maria was determined. When Maria was 16, Abuela Rosa got sick. The doctor bills were expensive, and they had to sell everything valuable they owned. The broken keyboard was one of the first things to go. Maria cried for 3 days after they sold it, but she understood. Abuela Rosa needed medicine more than Maria needed music. Abuela Rosa died 2 years later. Maria was 18 and completely alone in the world. She had to work full-time just to pay for her tiny apartment and basic food. There was no money for college, no money for piano lessons, no money for anything except survival. But Maria never stopped loving music. She got a job cleaning office buildings at night because it was quiet work that left her mind free to think about melodies and harmonies. Sometimes she would hum while she worked, creating new songs in her head. 3 years ago, when she got the job at the music hall, Maria felt like she had found a treasure. Every night after the concerts ended, she would sneak into the main hall and just look at the beautiful grand piano. Sometimes, when she was sure no one was around, she would touch the keys very gently and play soft melodies. The piano at the music hall was nothing like her grandmother's broken keyboard. Every key worked perfectly. The sound was rich and pure and powerful. Maria had learned to play dozens of songs on this piano during her lonely night shifts. She had taught herself pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin, playing them over and over until her fingers knew every note. But Maria had also created her own music, songs that told the story of her life, her grandmother's love, her struggles and dreams. Music that came from her heart instead of from books written by famous composers. Now, standing in front of Victor and his rich friends, all these memories rushed through Maria's mind in just a few seconds. She thought about Abuela Rosa, who always told her, "Music doesn't care if you're rich or poor, mija. Music only cares if you have love in your heart." Victor was still talking, still showing off for his audience. "Really, this is getting ridiculous. Look at her hands." He pointed at Maria's calloused fingers. Those are working hands, not musicians' hands. Do you see these? He held up his own hands, which were smooth and pale with long, elegant fingers. These are the hands of someone who has dedicated his life to music. Maria looked down at her hands. They were rough from cleaning chemicals and hard work. Her nails were short and practical. There were small scars from accidents with broken glass and sharp edges. But these hands had also made music. Beautiful. Music that came from her soul. You know what? Victor said suddenly, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. This is actually perfect. I was just talking about how real music requires proper training and education. Here's a chance to prove my point. He turned to address the remaining guests like he was giving a speech. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a perfect example of the difference between actual musicians and people who just think they can play. I propose we settle this matter once and for all. Mrs. Wellington clapped her hands together. Oh, how exciting! What do you have in mind, Victor? Victor smiled like a cat who had cornered a mouse. A musical duel. A competition. She claims she can play piano, so let's put it to the test. We'll each play a piece and you can all judge who the real musician is. The guests began talking excitedly among themselves. This was much more interesting than their usual boring charity. Events. A real contest between a world-famous pianist and a cleaning lady. It was like something from a movie. But we should make it interesting. Victor continued, warming to his theme. There should be stakes, something to make this worthwhile. What kind of stakes? Asked Mr. Pemberton, a wealthy businessman who collected rare musical instruments. Victor thought for a moment, then smiled wickedly. If she loses, which she obviously will, she has to admit publicly that she's not really a musician. And she has to quit her job here because clearly she doesn't respect this institution or the music it represents. The guests murmured their approval. This was getting better and better. And if by some miracle you think she wins? Victor laughed at the absurdity of the idea. Then I'll donate $50,000 to any music charity she chooses, and I'll publicly apologize for underestimating her abilities. $50,000. Maria's mind reeled. That was more money than she made in 2 years. With that much money, she could help so many kids learn music. Kids like she had been who loved music but couldn't afford lessons or instruments. But of course, Victor added with a smirk, that will never happen. So really I'm just offering to donate money to charity after I prove my point about real musicians versus pretenders. All eyes turned to Maria. She could feel the weight of their stares, their expectations, their assumptions about what someone like her could or couldn't do. Part of her wanted to run away, to go back to her quiet cleaning work and forget this ever happened. But then she thought about her grandmother again. Abuela Rosa had never backed down from a challenge when it mattered. She had worked 2 jobs to take care of Maria. She had taught Maria to be proud of who she was, no matter what other people thought. And Maria thought about all the other people. Like her, people who loved music but were told they didn't belong in fancy concert halls. People who were judged by their clothes or their jobs instead of their hearts. Okay, Maria said simply. Victor blinked in surprise. He had expected her to back down when faced with real consequences. Okay, what? I accept your challenge. The room erupted in excited chatter. Mrs. Wellington actually clapped her hands and said, "Oh, how thrilling! This is the most excitement we've had at one of these events in years." Victor recovered quickly from his surprise. If anything, her acceptance made him even more confident. This would be easier than he thought. Excellent. Then let's set the rules. We'll each play one piece, of our choosing. The first notes that came from Maria's fingers were soft and gentle, like raindrops on a quiet lake. The melody was simple at first, just a few notes that seemed to float in the air, but there was something about the way she played them that made the room fall silent. Victor had expected to hear clumsy amateur playing. He was ready to wince at wrong notes and poor timing. Instead, he found himself listening carefully, trying to understand what he was hearing. The melody Maria played was unlike anything in the classical repertoire Victor knew so well. It wasn't Mozart or Beethoven or Chopin. It was something entirely new, something that seemed to come from a place Victor had never been. As Maria continued to play, the simple melody began to grow and change. She added harmony with her left hand, creating a rich foundation for the song. Her fingers moved across the keys with surprising grace, despite their rough appearance. Each note was clear and purposeful. The music told a story without words. It spoke of loneliness and loss, but also of hope and determination. Victor found himself thinking of things he hadn't thought about in years. His childhood, his family, moments when music had meant more to him than fame or money. The guests in the audience had stopped whispering. Mrs. Wellington's mouth was slightly open, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Mr. Pemberton leaned forward in his seat, his businessman's face showing genuine surprise. Maria's playing grew stronger and more complex. She wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was having a conversation with the piano, sharing secrets that only music could express. Her rough hands, which Victor had mocked, proved to be incredibly sensitive and expressive. The song built to a gentle climax, with Maria's right hand playing a soaring melody while her left hand provided a rolling, rhythmic accompaniment. The music filled every corner of the concert hall, wrapping around the listeners like a warm embrace. Then, as softly as it had begun, the music faded away. Maria played the final notes with such tenderness that they seemed to hang in the air for a moment before dissolving into silence. The concert hall was completely quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Victor found himself holding his breath, still caught up in the emotion of what he had just heard. Finally, Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat. That was quite lovely, my dear." Mrs. Wellington nodded, slowly. "Very nice. Very heartfelt." The other guests murmured their agreement, though they seemed confused about how to react. They had come expecting to laugh at a cleaning lady's fumbling attempts at music. Instead, they had heard something genuine and moving. Victor shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't let himself be distracted by one simple song, no matter how pleasant it had been. This was still a competition, and he was still the superior musician. "Well," Victor said loudly, clapping his hands together, "that was charming, really quite charming for someone without formal training." His voice was bright and condescending, designed to put Maria back in her place. He walked over to the piano, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to show you what real classical music sounds like. What you just heard was nice, of course, but it was simple, amateur. It lacked the complexity and sophistication that define truly great music." Victor sat down at the piano bench and adjusted his position carefully. Everything about his posture screamed professional training. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed, his hands positioned at exactly the right height above the keys. "I We'll be playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, Victor announced. This is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. It requires years of training to master, perfect technique, and deep understanding of the Romantic tradition. He looked directly at Maria as he spoke. This is what real music sounds like. This is what separates trained musicians from people who just play around with simple melodies. The guests settled back in their seats, clearly more comfortable now that they were about to hear something familiar. This was the kind of music they understood, the kind they paid to hear at expensive concerts. Victor placed his hands on the keys and began to play. From the very first notes, it was obvious that Victor was technically brilliant. His fingers flew across the keyboard with incredible speed and precision. Every note was perfect, every rhythm exact. He had clearly spent thousands of hours practicing this piece until he could play it flawlessly. The music was dramatic and powerful, full of sweeping melodies and thunderous climaxes. Rachmaninoff had written it to showcase the piano's full range, from delicate whispers to crashing fortissimos that filled the entire hall with sound. Victor played with the confidence of someone who had performed this piece dozens of times in the world's greatest concert halls. His technique was flawless, his memory perfect. He never hesitated, never missed a note, never played anything less than exactly what the composer had written. The guests were clearly impressed. This was the kind of playing they expected from a world-famous pianist. Mrs. Wellington nodded approvingly at particularly difficult passages. Mr. Pemberton smiled with satisfaction, glad to hear music he recognized and understood. But as Victor played, something strange began to happen. Despite the technical perfection of his performance, despite the dramatic power of Rachmaninoff's composition, the music felt cold somehow. It was like watching a perfect machine perform a complex task, impressive, but not moving. Victor played, every note exactly as it was written, but there was no conversation with the piano, no sharing of secrets. He was demonstrating his mastery of the instrument rather than expressing anything personal or meaningful. Maria watched from the side of the stage, studying Victor's technique. She had to admit he was incredibly skilled. His fingers moved with a precision she could never match. His knowledge of classical music was vast and deep. Everything about his playing showed years of expensive education and professional training. But something was missing. Maria couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but the music felt empty despite its technical brilliance. It was like a beautiful painting with no soul behind it. Victor reached the most difficult section of the concerto, a passage that required both hands to play different rhythms at incredible speed. His fingers danced across the keys without a single mistake. The sound was powerful and impressive, filling the concert hall with complex harmonies and driving rhythms. The guests were clearly amazed by the display of technical skill. Several of them actually gasped at the most challenging passages. This was the kind of playing that justified Victor's international reputation. As Victor approached the final section of the piece, he threw himself into the music with even more dramatic flair. He swayed with the melody, his face showing intense concentration and artistic passion. His hands pounded the keys with controlled violence, drawing every ounce of power from the piano. The final chords crashed through the hall like thunder. Victor held the last notes until they faded completely away, then lifted his hands from the keys with a flourish. He sat still for a moment, breathing hard from the physical effort of the performance. The audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Mrs. Wellington clapped her jeweled hands together rapidly, her face glowing with admiration. "Magnificent!" she called out. "Absolutely magnificent!" "Bravo!" shouted Mr. Pemberton, rising from his seat. "That was extraordinary, Victor. Simply extraordinary." The other guests joined in the praise, showering Victor with compliments and superlatives. This was exactly the kind of reaction Victor was used to receiving. This was what real music sounded like to real music lovers. Victor stood up from the piano bench and took a dramatic bow. His face was flushed with triumph and exertion. He had just delivered a flawless performance of one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. No amateur, no matter how talented, could possibly compete with that level of skill and sophistication. Thank you," Victor said graciously, still breathing hard. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is what classical music is all about. Technical mastery, artistic interpretation, deep understanding of the great traditions." He turned to look at Maria, who was still standing quietly at the side of the stage. His expression was a mixture of pity and condescension. "Now do you understand the difference?" Victor asked her. "What you played was nice in its own simple way, but this is real music. This is what separates true artists from people who just dabble." The guests nodded their agreement. They had heard both performances now, and the contrast was obvious. Victor's playing had been technically superior in every way. His knowledge of classical music, his perfect technique, his dramatic interpretation, everything about his performance had been professional and polished. Maria's little song, while pleasant enough, seemed amateurish in comparison. It was like comparing a finger painting to a masterpiece by Da Vinci. Both might be art, but they clearly existed on completely different levels. "I think we can all agree on the winner here," Mrs. Wellington said with a satisfied smile. "Really, my dear," she addressed Maria directly, "it was sweet of you to try, but you must see now how outclassed you are." "Indeed," agreed Mr. Pemberton. Victor's confident smile froze on his face. "Excuse me, one more song? That wasn't part of our agreement. We each played one piece. The competition is over." "You're right," Maria said calmly. "The competition is over, but I'd still like to play something else, if that's okay. Not for the competition, just because I want to." The guests looked confused. Why would she want to play again after being so clearly defeated? Mrs. Wellington whispered to her friend, "Perhaps the poor dear doesn't understand that she's lost." Victor felt a flicker of annoyance. He had won decisively. The matter was settled. Why was this cleaning lady trying to drag things out? "Look, I appreciate your enthusiasm for music," he said with forced patience. "But really, I think we've all heard enough for one evening." "Have we?" Maria asked simply. She walked back toward the piano, her soft cleaning shoes making no sound on the polished floor. Something in her voice made Victor pause. There was a quality to it he hadn't noticed before. Not defiance exactly, but a quiet certainty that made him uncomfortable. "Please," Maria said, looking at the small audience. "Just one more song. Then I'll go back to my work." Mr. Pemberton checked his expensive watch. "Well, I suppose we have a few more minutes. Why not? Let the young lady play if she wants to." Mrs. Wellington nodded graciously. "Of course, dear. Though I do think Victor has already proven his point quite thoroughly." Victor wanted to object, but he couldn't think of a good reason to refuse without seeming petty. After all, he had already won. What harm could one more amateur song do? If anything, It would just reinforce how much better his performance had been. "Fine," Victor said with a dismissive wave. "Play whatever you like, but let's make this quick." Maria sat down at the piano bench again. This time, she didn't seem nervous or uncertain. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for a moment, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. When she began to play, the first notes were completely different from her earlier song. This music was deeper, more complex, with layers of meaning that seemed to unfold with each phrase. The melody started in the lower registers of the piano, played with Maria's left hand. It was a simple theme, but there was something haunting about it. It sounded like a lament, like someone crying for something lost. Victor frowned, listening more carefully than he wanted to. This didn't sound like the amateur playing he expected. The melody was sophisticated, the harmonies unexpected. Where had she learned to play like this? As the music continued, Maria's right hand joined in with a counter-melody that wove in and out of the main theme. The two musical lines danced around each other, sometimes coming together in perfect harmony, sometimes pulling apart in beautiful tension. The song began to tell a story. It spoke of poverty and struggle, of dreams deferred and opportunities denied. But it also spoke of persistence, of finding beauty in unexpected places, of the power of hope to survive even in the darkest times. Mrs. Wellington stopped whispering to her friend. Her face had grown serious as she listened to the music. There was something about this song that reached deeper than Victor's technical display, something that touched places in her heart she had forgotten existed. Maria's playing grew more confident and expressive. She wasn't just pressing keys anymore. She was painting with sound, creating images and emotions that filled the concert hall with invisible colors. The music spoke of Maria's grandmother, though the audience didn't know that. It told the story of an old woman working 2 jobs to raise a granddaughter, of sacrifice and love that asked for nothing in return. It sang of broken keyboards and borrowed music books, of dreams that refused to die no matter how difficult life became. Victor found himself leaning forward, drawn into the music despite himself. This wasn't possible. How could someone with no formal training play with such depth and understanding? Where was this music coming from? The song continued to evolve, incorporating elements that Victor had never heard in classical music before. There were rhythms that reminded him of Latin folk songs, harmonies that echoed gospel music, melodic phrases that seemed to come from jazz and blues traditions. But somehow it all worked together. Maria had taken influences from many different musical traditions and woven them into something entirely new, something that was uniquely her own. Mr. Pemberton felt something strange happening in his chest. He had attended hundreds of classical concerts over the years, had heard the world's finest orchestras and soloists. But this simple song, played by a cleaning lady on a piano in a nearly empty hall, was moving him in ways that all those professional performances had not. The music began to build toward something larger. Maria's hands moved across the keyboard with increasing intensity, but never lost the tenderness that had marked her playing from the beginning. She was telling the story of every person who had ever been overlooked, every dreamer who had been told they didn't belong. Victor watched Maria's face as she played. Her eyes were closed, and there was an expression of complete concentration and peace on her features. She wasn't performing for an audience. She was sharing something deeply personal, something that came from the very center of her being. This was what had been missing from his own performance, Victor realized with a shock. Technical perfection. Dramatic flair, sophisticated interpretation. He had delivered all of that. But he hadn't shared anything of himself. His music had been about proving his superiority, not about expressing truth or emotion. Maria's music continued to grow and develop. She introduced new themes that complemented the original melody, creating a rich tapestry of sound that seemed to contain all the joy and sorrow of human experience. The song spoke of community and connection, of people who supported each other through difficult times. It celebrated the strength found in simple acts of kindness, the beauty discovered in everyday moments. It honored the dignity of all work, all dreams, all hopes. Mrs. Wellington felt tears starting to form in her eyes. When had she last heard music that spoke to her this directly? Most of the concerts she attended were social events, opportunities to see and be seen by the right people. But this music was cutting through all the social pretense and reaching something real inside her. The music began to incorporate elements of celebration and triumph. Not the empty victory of defeating an opponent, but the deeper triumph of staying true to yourself despite pressure to conform. It was the sound of someone who had found her voice and refused to be silenced. Victor's hands clenched at his sides. He didn't want to admit it, but he was being profoundly affected by Maria's playing. This music was doing something his own performance had not done. It was making him feel something real. All his life, Victor had been taught that music was about technical mastery and artistic sophistication. He had spent years perfecting his technique, studying with famous teachers, learning to interpret the great classical works, but somewhere along the way, he had forgotten why music mattered in the first place. Maria's song reminded him of his childhood, when he had first fallen in love with the piano. Back then, before the competitions and critics and concert reviews, music had been about expression and joy. When had he lost that? When had music become more about proving himself than about sharing his heart? The song reached its climax, with Maria playing a complex passage that combined all the themes she had introduced. Her rough hands, which Victor had mocked, moved across the keys with grace and power. Every note rang clear and true. Every phrase carried emotional weight. This wasn't just technically impressive, it was deeply meaningful. Maria was demonstrating that true musical ability couldn't be measured only by how fast you could play scales, or how perfectly you could execute written music. Real musicianship was about having something to say and saying it honestly. As the music neared its end, Maria brought back the simple melody she had started with. But now it sounded different, transformed by everything that had come before. It was the same theme, but richer, deeper, more complete. The final notes were played with incredible gentleness, as if Maria was sharing a secret with the piano. The melody faded away slowly, leaving silence that felt full rather than empty. Maria lifted her hands from the keys and sat quietly for a moment. She didn't bow or acknowledge the audience. She simply sat with the music, letting it settle into the air around them. The concert hall was completely silent. No one moved or spoke. Even Victor found himself holding his breath, still caught up in the emotional journey Maria had taken them on. Finally, Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat softly. "My goodness," he said quietly. That was extraordinary." Mrs. Wellington nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I've never heard anything quite like it. It was so real." The other guests murmured their agreement, but their voices were subdued, almost reverent. They had all been affected by Maria's music in ways they didn't fully understand. Victor stood frozen by the side of the piano. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just heard. This couldn't be happening. A cleaning lady with no formal training couldn't possibly play music that profound, that moving, that sophisticated. The silence in the concert hall stretched on as Victor tried to understand what had just happened. His world had been turned upside down in the space of one song. Everything he believed about music, about talent, about what made someone a true artist was suddenly in question. Maria stood quietly by the piano, waiting to see what would happen next. She wasn't gloating or celebrating. If anything, she looked sad, as if she understood that her music had hurt Victor in some way she hadn't intended. Mr. Pemberton was the first to break the silence. "Young lady," he said to Maria, "where did you learn to play like that? That wasn't amateur music. That was art." Maria looked down at her hands. "I taught myself mostly. I had a broken keyboard when I was young, and I've been practicing here at night for the past 3 years." "Practicing here?" Mrs. Wellington asked in surprise. "You mean during your work shifts?" Maria nodded. "After everyone goes home, I clean. The concert hall lasts. Sometimes I would sit at the piano for a few minutes and play quietly. I always made sure not to disturb anything or cause any problems." Victor felt a strange sensation in his chest. While he had been performing in famous concert halls around the world, earning praise and money for his technical skills, Maria had been here in this very room, practicing alone in the dark, creating music from her heart with no audience except the empty seats. "But how?" Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you learn to play with such depth, such understanding? I've studied with the finest teachers in the world, and I've never—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He had never played music that moved people the way Maria's simple song had moved this audience. Despite all his training, all his technical perfection, he had never connected with listeners on the level Maria had just achieved. Maria looked at Victor with compassion in her dark eyes. "Music isn't something you learn from books or teachers," she said gently. "It's something you feel. My grandmother always told me that the piano doesn't care if you're rich or poor, educated or not. It only cares if you have something real to say." "Your grandmother?" Mrs. Wellington asked softly. Maria smiled for the first time that evening. "She raised me after my parents died. She found an old broken keyboard in a dumpster and brought it home for me. Half the keys didn't work, but I loved it anyway. I learned to make music with what I had." Victor thought about his own childhood. His parents had bought him the finest piano money could buy when he was 5 years old. He had taken lessons from expensive teachers, attended the best music schools, played on concert-quality instruments his entire life. But somehow, Maria had learned more about music from a broken keyboard than he had learned from all his advantages. "I don't understand," Victor said, sinking into one of the audience chairs. "I've worked so hard. I've dedicated my entire life to music. I can play the most difficult pieces in the repertoire. I've performed for world leaders and celebrities. How can someone with no training play more beautifully than I can?" The question hung in the air like a confession. Victor had always believed that his success proved his superiority as a musician. But Maria's performance had shown him that technical skill and professional success weren't the same thing as true artistry. Maria walked over and sat in the chair next to Victor. "You do play beautifully," she said kindly. "Your technique is amazing. I could never play Rachmaninoff the way you just did." "But?" Victor asked, sensing there was more. "But," Maria continued gently, "when you played, it felt like you were trying to prove something. Like you were showing off your skills instead of sharing your feelings. Music is supposed to be a conversation, not a lecture. Victor stared at the piano, processing Maria's words. She was right, he realized. His entire approach to music had been about demonstrating his superiority, proving his worth, maintaining his reputation. When had music stopped being about joy and expression and become just another way to compete? Mrs. Wellington stood up and walked over to where Victor and Maria were sitting. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been attending concerts at this hall for 20 years. I've heard hundreds of technically perfect performances, but tonight was the first time in years that music actually made me feel something real." She looked directly at Victor. "Your playing was impressive, dear. Truly impressive. But it was cold. It was like watching a machine perform calculations, no matter how complex those calculations were." Victor winced at her words, but he knew they were true. He had spent so many years perfecting his technique that he had forgotten how to express genuine emotion through music. He had become a skilled performer, but had he ever really been an artist? Mr. Pemberton joined the conversation. "I have to agree with Eleanor," he said to Mrs. Wellington. "Victor, your technical skills are undeniable. But Maria's music came from somewhere deeper. It told stories, painted pictures, made us feel things we hadn't felt in years." Victor looked around at the small group of people who had been his admirers just an hour earlier. They weren't being cruel or dismissive of his abilities. They were simply being honest about what they had experienced. "So what does this mean?" Victor asked quietly. "Have I been doing everything wrong my entire career?" Maria shook her head. "No, not wrong. Just incomplete, maybe? You have incredible skills that I'll never have, but maybe you could use those skills to say something more personal, something that comes from your heart instead of just your training." Victor was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Maria's words. He remembered being a child, before the competitions and critics and pressure to succeed. Back then, he had loved the piano simply because it made beautiful sounds. He had played because it made him happy, not because he wanted to impress anyone. When had that changed? When had music become more about winning than about expressing himself? "I owe you an apology," Victor said suddenly, looking at Maria. "The way I treated you tonight was terrible. I judged you based on your job and your appearance instead of listening to your music. I was arrogant and cruel." Maria smiled sadly. "You weren't the first person to judge me that way. Probably won't be the last either." "But that doesn't make it right," Victor insisted. "I pride myself on being a sophisticated, educated person, but I acted like a snob and a bully. You showed me more grace and kindness than I deserved." He stood up and faced the small audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I made a wager earlier tonight. I said that if Maria could play better than me, I would donate $50,000 to a music charity and publicly apologize." Victor's voice got stronger as he continued. "Well, Maria didn't just play better than me. She played music that was more honest, more meaningful, and more beautiful than anything I've performed in years. She reminded me what music is supposed to be about." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to make that donation right now. Maria, what charity would you like me to support?" Maria looked surprised. "You don't have to do that. The competition was just about playing, not about winning or losing money." "Yes, I do have to do it," Victor said firmly. "Not because of some bet, but because it's the right thing to do, and because I want to support music education for kids who might not have the advantages I had." Maria thought for a moment. "There's a community center in East LA where I grew up. They try to provide music lessons for kids whose families can't afford private teachers. They always need instruments and supplies. Perfect, Victor said, typing on his phone. $50,000 to... He looked up at Maria questioningly. Esperanza Community Center, Maria said softly. Done, Victor said, showing Maria the confirmation screen on his phone. The money will be there tomorrow. Mrs. Wellington clapped her hands together. How wonderful! And Victor, I think you should do more than just apologize. I think you should learn from what happened here tonight. What do you mean? Victor asked. Mr. Pemberton stepped forward. You have incredible technical skills, Victor, and Maria has something you've lost, the ability to speak directly to people's hearts through music. What if you could combine those things? Victor looked at Maria thoughtfully. Would you be willing to teach me? I know that sounds crazy, asking someone with no formal training to teach a professional musician. But you understand something about music that I've forgotten. Maria looked surprised. I don't know what I could teach you. You know so much more about music theory and technique than I do. But you know something more important, Victor said earnestly. You know how to make music that matters. You know how to touch people's souls. I can play any piece ever written, but I've forgotten how to make people cry with a simple melody. Maria was quiet for a moment, thinking. Maybe we could learn from each other, she said finally. You could help me improve my technique, and maybe I could help you reconnect with why you started playing music in the first place. Victor felt something lifting in his chest, a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. I would like that very much, Mrs. Wellington smiled warmly. This is turning into quite the evening. Victor, I think this could be the beginning of something wonderful for your career. Music that combines technical mastery with genuine emotion. That's something truly special.